Hey guys, this is Anon, and today we're going to talk about one of the classics here for Blitz, the Tier 10 German heavy tank E100. And this is one of the original Tier 10 tanks to Blitz, and has had quite a storied history. It's immensely popular with the player base because being so early, so many players have it. And it's also extremely controversial. Lots of people love it, lots of people hate it, people play it different ways. So it's really important to go ahead and take a look at it, especially after the recent nerfs we've seen to Tier 10 medium tanks that has made this tank quite a bit stronger. The armor profile is extremely powerful as long as you're using it the right way, because it's got some weaknesses, and in general this tank has a lot of weaknesses. It's got a strange gun, strange armor profile, it's big, it's slow, but it's also very, very powerful, and in good hands this thing absolutely can dominate a game. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look and see how you can dominate with it, how you can kill it, and we'll go from there. Okay, so jumping right into compare tanks, I basically pulled in all of the Tier 10 heavies that aren't auto-loading, because I think auto-loaders really kind of live in a class of their own. We can compare them to other tanks, but for this purpose I don't think it really serves. Doesn't necessarily do a lot of justice. And also I think it's really interesting to compare Tier 10 heavy tanks because they're one of the most varied groups in Blitz. A lot of tank classes tend to run together. When you think of like Tier 7 mediums, Tier 8 heavies, things like this, frequently tanks are very, very similar with just slight differences. But in Tier 10 heavies, we have a lot of variants, a lot of different profiles, a lot of different playstyles. So we'll look at the stats, but it's only really one small part that tells the entire story of how these work together. So I went ahead and did a standard equipment loadout. I think 99% of people are going to use this setup for Tier 10 heavy tanks, which is vents, rammer, and a vertical stabilizer. Actually, I don't honestly see a whole lot of reason to run anything different. I guess you could make an argument for a GLD over something like vents, but for me this is pretty straightforward, and I wouldn't do really anything else personally. So going right in on DPM, we can see that it is pretty middle of the pack, nothing necessarily fantastic or bad, and in general this is one of the stats that the Tier 10 heavies do tend to run kind of close together. We can see the outlier here of the FV215B having by far the best DPM for a Tier 10 heavy, but it sacrifices in other ways, and it's really known as a gun carrier with that really, really powerful gun, but not necessarily as much armor as some of the others. So that's not necessarily a surprise. Some of the super heavies in the Russians having slightly less DPM, but again, they're all pretty comparable. These tanks, where they start to vary is really how they dish out that damage. And as soon as we start to look into some of these gun numbers and ammo numbers, I have to point out that I have the E100 loaded up with the 15 centimeter. For me, that is definitely the gun of choice. There is a 12.8, but you can still kind of see it compared because it is the same gun that is on the mouse. That 12.8 centimeter 44L55 is the exact same gun as the stock option on the E100, but for me, the 15 centimeter boomstick is really where it's at. That's what is kind of special about this tank. So with that in mind, we can jump right in and see that the AP pen is pretty much terrible. At 235, this tank is notorious for it. You can get through the side of tanks fairly easily in backs, things like that, some mediums, but this is a tank that you have to run a lot of premium ammo with it, and you just have to recognize that. You shouldn't be mad at other players for it, you shouldn't be upset with yourself for doing it, it's just what you have to do. Top of the AP or pens in here, actually you have the IS-7, which is a little bit surprising, and the E5, IS-4. All these tanks are really, really in line, but you can see when we switch over to the heat, we get quite a bit better values of 334 on the pen, which is actually in the middle of the pack to on the top side of the pack, so that makes a huge difference. The downside there is that heat is notoriously unreliable, and so you need to be careful. You can't shoot it into tracks, doesn't do well in space. Any spaced armor, it will bounce at angles, so it struggles a little bit, and so that's a downside with this tank, but we're going to continue to talk about all the good things about it too. And you can see where that's where it flips the IS-7, even though it had really good AP pen, has pretty horrible APCR. Pramo pen at 303, it doesn't get through a whole lot. The mouse, so you can see even that 12.8 other option then starts to lag behind with the premium ammunition, and even the 215B isn't quite as good. The Americans are quite a bit better all around with that pen, and actually leaving the autoloaders out, the 50B, the French autoloading tank, is pretty fantastic with that as well. So going back over, yes, you're going to have to use a lot of Pramo. That's just how it works. But on the flip side, what you get is this fantastic 640 Alpha. And that is pretty fantastic. The stopping power of that is great. It gives you a lot of ammo racks because you just have that huge shell size, and you're doing a lot of damage to modules when you hit. So what's great for me about the E100 is just about how you're going to dish out that damage. Yes, it's right in line with everybody else with DPM, but you don't have to fire as many shots to do it. It means you can poke out, take that shot, work your angle in the right ways, which is something we're going to talk about a lot as we get into Armor Inspector, because this is an interesting armor profile. It just gives you a lot of possibilities to conserve those hit points, which you have a great hit point pool. So it's almost got that tank destroyer quality to it. I'm probably going to talk about this a lot, but what really clicked for me personally when I started playing this tank, because I have kind of a storied history with it. I got it early, stopped playing it for a long time. It went through lots of buffs and nerfs, and when I picked it up again, I basically had this epiphany that it is a frontline tank destroyer, and it doesn't sound like much of a difference, but when you think about it that way, and the long reload times and doing damage in short bursts, then it makes you, I think, a little bit more conscious of what the tank is, and for me, that's what it actually is. So, got a little off track there, but we'll continue going. Obviously, the rate of fire is going to be pretty low because of that alpha, 4.37, but like I said, it's just about making those individual shots count. 150 caliber, of course. The shell velocity is really, really bad with this as well. 757 standard, which is by far the lowest, and the heat is a horrible, horrible 606. That's pretty derpy. You're going to have to really give a lot of lead on moving targets, or just be careful with it, especially long ranges. So just something to keep in mind with that gun. The big calibers like that just tend to be slow, and that's just kind of how it goes. Getting into gun handling, it is actually surprisingly not too bad, or call it in line with things. 2.31 adjusted aim time is, right along with some of these other big tanks, the IS-7, the IS-4, the Mouse. It's obviously not as good as the E5 and the 215B, but those are tanks that are really known for their gun handling. 0.355 dispersion is actually really good for a derp style gun. It's right in line with an IS-7, which has quite a bit less stopping power with 460 and 133 millimeter gun, and better than the IS-4, better than the Mouse. I mean, for a 15 centimeter, that is really fantastic dispersion. Also, really pretty solid on the move on rotation as well. It's got a pretty slow traverse, so that's part of what probably helps with it. Excuse me. Gun depression of 7 degrees is perfectly fine. It lets you really work hills. It's a very tall tank, so that's part of it. You need that gun depression to get down on some lower profile tanks, but 7 degrees certainly gets it done. Better than the Russians. Again, as to be expected, not as good as the E5. And surprisingly, the Mouse has 1 degree more too, but again, that tank is gigantic, so it needs all the gun depression it can get. Mobility is also not as bad as you would necessarily think. 30 kilometers forward, 15 backwards. For a super heavy, that is not horrible because it's got a lot of engine power. Obviously, it's not the speed demon that some of these other tanks are. Like the IS-7 is just fantastically fast for a heavy. That's what is so remarkable at it, and it'll come time for another video. Even the IS-4 at 43, but 30 is certainly not bad, and it moves it around well enough. It doesn't feel quite as sluggish as some other tanks, even though the power to weight ratio is a fairly bad 10.16. Actually, that's very bad. There's no reason to sugarcoat it. That's not a very good power to weight ratio, but I think you notice that mostly on hills because of the type of gun this is. And like I said, if you're thinking about it as a tank destroyer, to me it doesn't feel as slow as it necessarily can be. Resistances, not necessarily fantastic, but not too bad either. It's some of these values, so again, you can move around just fine. Traverse at 20 degrees, it's a super heavy. It's kind of what comes along with it. 85% credit coefficient. I only mention that because it's better than most other Tier 10 heavy tanks. Tier 10 has notoriously bad credit coefficients, so what that really means is that you don't have to be quite as afraid to shoot heat because you're not firing a lot of rounds per game. This isn't a tank that's necessarily going to lose horrible even if you are firing a lot of premium ammunition. And one of the best things with the armor profile is that you also get 2300 hit points, which is second best to tier 10 and pretty fantastic behind only the mouse. So there's a huge hit point pool to work with. 130 tons, of course, because it is that super heavy. It may not be fast, but if you can connect with another tank ramming, you're going to do a lot of damage. Alright, what really starts to matter, I think, with these super heavies is the armor profile, and this is unique, and if you're at least even mildly familiar with this tank, you know that it has some weak spots, and we're going to get into it shortly, but still the effective armor on it is pretty fantastic. Hull at 200, 120, and 150, which makes it some of the absolute best for its tier. It's actually right in line with the mouse, except on the sides where the mouse has that great 185, but still 200 frontal. It just has some flat areas, so you have to be aware of that. And the turret being at 250, 150, 150, also some of the best at its tier, except for some tanks like the IS-4 and the IS-7. I mean, what's unique about that is it's sloping, so the effective armor is much higher on the IS-7, but still, this is plenty to get the job done, and you can see it's actually not that much worse than the mouse, and with similar weak points. Okay, for me, the number one thing you need to look at when we're talking about these heavies are the armor profile, like I keep mentioning. So here we are in Armor Inspector, and I have it loaded up against a T110E5 American Tier 10 Heavy, because like I showed in the stat compare, it actually has some of the highest penetration values at Tier 10 because it's a very good gun. And right off the bat, you can see pretty obviously that, yeah, this is pretty legit armor. As you know, if you've seen this, you've got the lower plate that's an extreme weakness. Yes, you need to protect that as much as possible, but especially against standard AP, as soon as you start to get some good angles or uphill or anything, even that disappears. And look at all that red now. Yeah, the only green you see is this tiny sliver of viewport at the top, and if you know from experience, that is an extremely hard target to hit. They're not going to hit it reliably, so that's not necessarily a concern. The main thing where you're going to get shot in this E100 is, you can see as we angle here, you've got this inner hole right behind the tracks, and that is the number one place you want to shoot an E100. It tracks them in place, and also is all but guaranteed damage. The penetration, it just goes through so much as long as they're shooting standard AP instead of heat. So really fantastic, but this armor is just absolutely crazy. But I'm not going to focus a whole lot on the AP because, as most of you know, as soon as you run into another tier tank, high tier tank, what they're most likely to do is go ahead and hit this right here and load that heat, which has so much more penetration. And now this is a completely different story. Look at all this green we have going on. That being said, in the heat of battle, this is not necessarily the easiest target to hit, and frequently they will miss it and hit this mantlet. But what's really key with this tank is angling, and that is why I was really focusing on the high alpha, because you don't have to be exposed as long as other tanks are. And as soon as you fire that round off, what you need to do is start working to angle these turrets. Fire and angle, because even though yes, this is much lighter colors now. There we go, kind of a better angle. As soon as you start to angle, now we're looking at 50% rolls with premium ammo, and heat is notoriously unreliable. So you're shooting in here, and now it's only a 56% chance. So if you're rolling back into cover while angling this, it's extremely less likely that you're going to be penetrated. And honestly, in Blitz, there's not a lot of tanks that can say that. Premium ammo goes through a lot of targets, and this is just really strong. What's also really special about this, in my opinion, is, again, like I was mentioning earlier, the medium nerf that we saw in the last couple updates to really reduce the heat penetration of mediums. And unfortunately, Armor Inspector isn't caught up with that, but I can tell you it's much closer to the standard AP. It's just over this. When you're firing heat in most of the mediums now into this turret, it's a 50-50 roll no matter what, and that's with their premium ammunition. So you can really go in there and start to be a lot more effective against mediums. It's a huge difference. Armor has really started to pick up again in Blitz, and I think that's incredibly important. The other weakness I want to point out is this turret ring. Again, it is a weakness and most tanks can get through it, but it's very, very small. It gets missed a lot. You can't reliably pen it. It's mostly something you want to shoot at if you're getting face hugged by this tank, because unless you have good heat or good AP or good premium ammunition penetration values, it's hard to get through these cheeks. So anyway, lots and lots of red, great side scraper, and like I'm going to point out in a lot of the vehicles, the number one thing is to make sure you're just angling this turret as much as possible. As soon as I fire, I like to angle this and pull away and just create odd angles. When you're at corners, I like to back up at an angle, and so you can absorb as many shots with these risky pens as you're angled out in the lower plate, or hope that they're still loading heat to shoot at your turret and go ahead and take that shot into your tracks and have no damage and just take the track as well. So very powerful armor profile, and I talked about this a little bit more than I do for other, I think, videos, but I think that is what is really so important with this tank. Okay, so let's get into some gameplay to see how I personally handle this beast. So we're right here on Rockfield, and I'm going to go ahead and go kind of the standard direction to kind of this northern side. One thing that's going to be a little interesting about both of these gameplays I'm going to show is they're actually from before the medium nerf, so this tank is actually more powerful against high tier mediums now instead of less powerful, and so just something to keep in mind that it is actually even stronger than this gameplay shows, and I'm still going to bounce plenty of shots as well. So when I see stuff spotted to the left that quickly, I like to come up to this location because it instantly gives the capability of flanking. But the other thing that I think is really important about this spot is it keeps the other team from flanking you. I see this as kind of an epidemic in Rockfield, that a lot of teams ignore this little section, and it can find you winning or losing the game pretty quickly. Okay, so one thing you will notice is I go ahead and start the game frequently in this tank with heat, and that is just because I want the higher chance of pens. I would say I'm somewhere in between spamming it and not spamming. I just use it when it's appropriate. And you can also see what I did right off the bat. As soon as I shot that E100, I immediately turned my turret at an angle and he bounced right off of it. That's exactly how you have to play this tank all day, every single time. You can't get complacent about it or you will take shots. I shoot him and I'm instantly rotating my turret away. It doesn't matter necessarily which direction you're turning it, you just want to get that 45-degree angle on those turret cheeks to make it more difficult to pen. And I'll face a couple other E100s through this process too, and you can see why I'm able to shoot them, because they're giving me that capability. One thing I didn't talk about in the stats a whole lot is the fact that because it's a 15 centimeter, and again, look at the full angle away, angle the hull, angle the turret, bounce the shot. That's how you live and die in this tank. Anyway, I didn't talk a whole lot about the HE on this tank, but being a 15 centimeter gun, it has 85 millimeters of pen, which is enough to get through a lot of soft targets, especially Leo PTA, Leo 1, stuff like that. So don't be afraid to switch that, and also because of the high millimeter of this gun, it can roll pretty high. So if you're in a tough situation, even against strong tanks, like you'll see probably in the next gameplay a little bit more, if stuff is being really pesky, you can shoot that HE at strong turrets and basically make them nervous into making mistakes or start to rush. So I'm really just doing exactly what I talked about in stats. I'm poking out, firing, rolling back. I'm not angling my turret here because I'm behind cover, so I'm not necessarily as concerned about it. I'd rather stay on target and be able to make those great shots like that one right there into the cupola of an IS-8. That's a pretty precise shot that I'm excited about. You can also see switching back to AP here, ammo selection is so incredibly important. So I knew firing into the tracks on the IF-7, it would just eat the heat, so you want to fire that AP. I'm just switching back and forth. I've used all three ammo types in this game, and that's what's important. Now that his tracks are a little covered, that's why I switch back to the heat and shoot at his turret, because the spaced armor at the top of the hull struggles a bit, so instead I'm going for the softer side of the turret with the heat and getting the good pen. Now I could just go ahead and push through, again take the nice safe stuff, poking around. This is really just good solid gameplay at this point, pushing the targets when I can. I'm trying to get the ram in here because this tank is so heavy, but the biggest concern is just getting through. Again, HE into the back of the American medium. And I go ahead and do that knowing I'm probably going to take a shot from the 268 because it's late game and I'm trying to make sure we get rid of the stronger, deadlier targets. But instead, because of that great angling on the turret, can bounce the object 268 shell and continue on. This is just textbook exactly how you want to drive this tank. You can be a bully, controlled aggression, choose the right targets when you have a big gun. It's okay to take damage over kills at times because it's what helps your team more, and you can end with the fantastic ram kill, which is just an entertaining way to do it. So good, clean gameplay, lots of angling. This is, like I said, very, very textbook on how you want to handle the E100 in my opinion. Pushing the flank as much as possible and just making sure we can keep the pressure on that team as much as we can. Okay, so we'll do one more here just to again show kind of the versatility of this tank a little bit and why you really need to be on the front line with it as much as possible. That's another thing I haven't necessarily talked about in great length, and that's tank roles. The super heavies have a job to do, essentially, and in most situations your job is to be in the front, distract. Yes, I want to deal damage, absolutely, but I want to stop my team from taking damage as much as possible. And if you're hiding in the back with a tank like this without fantastic gun handling, but this great armor, you're doing your team a disservice and you're hurting. Now, I'm not saying YOLO because that's absolutely not smart. The key is to get into a position where you've got cover, but you're also on the front line as much as possible, and you can draw the shots with and put yourself in a position to shoot but not take a lot of damage. It's basically just tanking 101, and so I'm always going to get as forward as I can in a safe position. So I took my time on the Leo, and that's why I did take a shot from the IS-8, but I can see the other tanks looking at me, and you can see the angling on the turret right there, and I bounced multiple shots. That is what I'm doing. All of those shells could have gone to my teammate, but instead now what am I up to 3 or 4 shells I've already bounced that is preventing it from going into my teammate, and they're starting to shoot HE at me. We are barely a minute into this game and they're shooting HE at me in a frustrated manner. Now I'm shooting a lot of HE here and getting bad pen rolls because I have the soft targets of the Type 61 and the Leo PTA. If any of those would have actually gone through, it would have been for 700, 800, 900 damage. So it was unfortunate I didn't get those pens, but that's just something you run a risk of that sometimes with the HE ammunition. So I'm just rolling back into cover, rolling forward again. I'm being a frontline tank destroyer. I want to do damage, but as soon as I take a shot, I want to roll back. The HE being fired at me is annoying, but it's not necessarily a bad tactic. They're whittling me down slowly, but I can still go in. That E100 you can see right there is not angling his turret away from me, so I'm able to put a heat round straight through his cheeks, and that's the opportunities I'm not letting him have on me. I'll keep the turret focused in as I roll up, and as soon as I turn away or take that shot is when I'm going to go ahead and start rotating out and try and be as safe with it as possible. So now it's just a lot of waiting game, and this is a very patient tank. Even though you're on the front line, you're reloading so slow that you can't get in a rush. Take your time, let that ammo load again before you poke out and take another shot. But I'm really trying to hold this entire side. Yeah, I've got a T95 to my left, but because he's so strong, they're much more likely to shoot at me. And just drawing as much fire as possible. So again, letting it reload. The IS-7 pushing pretty hard on the other side. What I'm really keeping an eye on are the 3 tanks over in spawn area, the red spawn. They just killed my last teammate over there, which means they're going to be heading up this direction, and that's something I have to keep an eye on, and that's why I go ahead and push, because those tanks are coming. They can swarm a bit, so it's something I need to really try and be careful of. Missed the HE shot on the kill shot on the IS-8, but again, that's just the poor dispersion you run in sometimes. Anyway, again, just continue on. Now they're rolling up exactly like you would expect. And this is going to turn it into a much slower game. That IS-7 is very, very hull down. I'm trying to sneak a shot in, but just as equally trying to get rid of that soft cover so I could see him better. But he pushed through, so it ended up not being as big of a deal, but is still trying to as well. And again, just looking for any shots. They're being very cautious here. And a 3-on-2 situation, but not a gimme 3-on-2 because our IS-7's almost dead. And the T-95 has stayed back through most of the game. He hasn't been overly dependable or pushing the way you would like to see a T-95 do. Yes, he's rolling up now, but he's doing it extremely slowly, and I'm trying to make sure he stays a part of the game as well. Okay, so I'm rotating a bit because they're staying down, and I was hoping to go ahead and circle around, but then as that 263 pops out, I'm hoping to get the shot in, and that IS-7 gets a great shot into my turret. That was a small window, essentially a snapshot with APCR into that cheek, and that's just something you have to manage with this tank. I say angle out in between shots, but you still have to angle towards them to take a shot. So you're always going to have some vulnerability. You're just trying to minimize it as much as possible. And I think that's why the IS-7 is so famous or infamous, whatever you want to call it. It's strong as long as it's hull down. So this is I would say a higher skill level tank to play. But could still be just as effective, if not more so. Alright, so I was trying to get a heat shell into his angled turret, and unfortunately don't get it. And I'm really just being careful, and I'm starting to think I'm going to have to fire some HE at him because these are small windows, but get kind of a beautiful hand there, a little hope with RNG, and it just slips in, which is good because the health difference is starting to get a little bit more significant, and my T-95 doesn't seem to be succeeding too well. That is exactly the shot I needed there because he just overextends, pokes that hull out too far, and again you can poke that heat shell in. This game, obviously I'm firing more heat than I did in the last one, but it's because it's what it needs. It just sometimes you just have to fire it and not really worry so much. So now that he's hull down, I do that HE shell because I'm hoping to get a high roll, and that was actually a pretty high roll, just not quite enough to do it. But as I angle to take a peek, that IS-7 gets one into my cheek. Is another great shot. He's playing this really as well as you can, except for, unfortunately for him, missing on a couple as I angled out before, and overextending on that hull. The IS-7, you have to be really careful about it. Okay, so now that my T-95 fell, I'm most concerned about the 263, and I know now my camo is reset, so he's probably trying to push around to my backside, and that's why I'm not taking the time to turn around, because I want to keep my gun forward, and exactly as I thought, he did it, and that is a 1 in a million shot. I'm not going to try and sugarcoat it. That was super lucky, super fantastic, and now I know I just need a nice little HE round into this IS-7, turn for the shot, and it goes right into his gun mantlet for 0. So sad. That was the kill shot. I'm trying to reload, but he's got me on reload, and I do misplay this a bit. I rolled out. I did exactly the opposite of what I've been talking about. Instead of letting myself load and face him, I pulled out while still loading, and instead take the loss. So well played game, but mistake at the end, and that's just something that happens, but still a great example of how to carry with this tank. So like I said, very controversial tank, so many layers to it. I hope this helps a little bit, both in driving it and also in killing it. It's a really fun tank, and I think with the changes in Blitz, heavies are become so much more important that I think this is one really worthy of people picking up again if you've kind of shelved it or grinding towards it. It's a good line, a lot of good tanks there. And so again, I hope this helps, and take care, guys.